What if the African gods, who for centuries have been called myths, legends, or pagan entities, are, in fact, the forgotten spiritual ancestors of the Old Testament? What if what we call African mythology is just a layer of fog cast over a much deeper truth, a truth that connects the heart of Africa to the cradle of the Judeo-Christian faith? Get ready, because in this video, we're going to delve into one of the greatest spiritual mysteries of all time, the hidden connections between African gods and the powerful figures that appear in biblical writings. This isn't just another theory. It's an invitation to question everything you've been taught about spirituality, divine origin, and the true spiritual ancestry of humanity. For centuries, African spiritual traditions have been silenced, demonized, and dismissed as superstition, while the Old Testament has been elevated as the sole divine truth. But what if, behind this forced separation, an invisible bridge exists? What if the so-called gods like Zango, Obatala, Oxum, Ogun, and so many others are not rival entities of the biblical faith, but rather spiritual manifestations that carry traits, names, functions, and even archetypes surprisingly similar to the spiritual characters and figures of the Old Testament? Today you will discover clues that have been hidden for centuries. And we're not talking about guesswork. We're talking about historical traces, spiritual parallels, and sacred languages that point to a common ancestry. There are texts, oral traditions, archaeological records, and cultural codes that reveal an impressive intertwining between ancestral African spirituality and the foundations of biblical Judaism, connections that are not recounted from pulpits nor taught in theological schools. Because if they were, they could transform the way you see God, the Bible, and above all yourself. In this video, you will understand why African cultures are mentioned and simultaneously ignored in the scriptures. We will explore how Egypt, Ethiopia, and the regions of Cush, Put, and Canaan feature prominently in the origins of the biblical narrative. We will show the striking parallels between the Elohim of the Old Testament and the Orishas of the Yoruba tradition. You will see why so many symbols, archetypes, and spiritual functions are repeated in traditions that never had direct physical contact, but which seem to have drawn from the same divine source. We will question why African spiritual knowledge was demonized, and what role European colonization played in this process of erasure. We will also bring to light evidence that African tribes may be direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and analyze the linguistic similarities between archaic Hebrew and African languages such as Yoruba and Iwe. Furthermore, we will delve into little-known theories about fallen angels, spiritual censorship, and the possibility that the true origin of humanity and of divine revelation is deeply rooted in African soil. This video is a call to look beyond the veil. We are not here to deny the Bible, but to reveal what has been hidden, silenced, or reinterpreted throughout the centuries. If you've ever felt something was disconnected in the traditional narrative, if you've ever had the intuition that Africa holds more than history books reveal, or if you seek to understand your spiritual identity more deeply, prepare for a transformative journey. With each topic, we will open a new door. And in the end, perhaps you will never read the Old Testament the same way again, because what lies behind this story is more than controversial. It's liberating. And now the question remains, are you ready to face this truth? Because in the next segment, we'll go straight to the point where it all begins, the purposeful forgetting of a divine heritage that cries out to be rediscovered. So, before we delve deeper into this ancestral mystery, I want to ask you something simple, but extremely important. If this content has already begun to awaken something within you, if these connections are making you reflect in a different way, leave a like now. This isn't just about numbers. The like shows YouTube that this topic is relevant and helps this message reach other people who are also seeking to understand their spiritual roots. And take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because what's coming in the next few minutes may be even more revealing. Here, we go deep, without fear, touching on subjects that few have the courage to explore. Oh, and I really want to know what you think about all this. Do you believe that African gods may have been real figures connected to biblical history? Have you heard anything similar? Comment below, because the conversation continues in the comments, and often new truths emerge there when the community comes together to reflect and share. So comment, like, and subscribe. Because the journey is just beginning. But why is it that, when we delve into the pages of the Old Testament, we find so few direct mentions of the great African civilizations, except for Egypt? Is it really true that the continent that gave birth to humanity only played a secondary role in the sacred narrative? Or is there a veil, a kind of historical fog that has been cast over the contributions and spiritual connections of African peoples to the origin of biblical faith? This is the kind of question most people avoid asking because it's uncomfortable, it provokes. But here, in this video, we face these questions head-on. In African traditions, ancestry is not an abstract idea. It is a living presence. The ancestor is not merely someone who has passed away, but a continuous, active link that transmits wisdom, identity, and spirituality. It is not about worshiping the dead, as many mistakenly believe, but about recognizing that our existence is rooted in a spiritual lineage that spans centuries. In many cultures of the African continent, ancestors are consulted, respected, honored, and seen as invisible advisors who help guide life. Ancestry, therefore, is foundation, direction, and root. Now think about this. Why does this concept, so profound and essential in African culture, simply disappear when we read the Old Testament scriptures? Why do the sacred texts, which recount genealogies with such care, ignore or minimize the ancestral memory of African peoples? The only major African civilization that gains space in the narrative is Egypt, and even then it is almost always portrayed as oppressive, as an enemy of the Hebrew people. Doesn't that sound strange to you? Are we dealing with an intentional selection of information? Does the Old Testament present only part of the story, leaving aside civilizations that possibly influenced the people of Israel spiritually and culturally? The Bible itself states that the sons of Ham, one of Noah's sons, gave rise to peoples such as Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, all of them located in and around Africa. Cush, for example, is associated with Ethiopia. Mizraim is Egypt itself. These connections are real. They are there, but they are treated as footnotes in the narrative. What if these civilizations were not merely neighbors, but active participants in spiritual revelation? What if the Hebrew patriarchs, such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had contact with knowledge and traditions that came precisely from these African lands? Wouldn't it be logical to think that by moving among different peoples, they absorbed beliefs, languages, and spiritual visions that would later be synthesized into the doctrines of the people of Israel? Official history has taught us to think of the Bible within an exclusively Hebrew framework with occasional Egyptian influences, as if the rest of Africa were a spiritual vacuum. But one only needs to look at the weight of African ancestry, vibrant, intense, and spiritually coherent, to realize that something is missing from this puzzle. The Bible speaks of kings, prophets, wars, and promises, but rarely mentions the griots, the tribal spiritual leaders, the guardians of ancestral African knowledge, as if they never existed, or as if they had been erased. It's impossible to talk about spirituality without talking about memory. And for Africans, memory isn't something that stays in the past. It's alive, cyclical, transmitted through generations. Each ancestor's name is a spiritual code, a key to wisdom, a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Many names of African deities, such as Obatala, Zango, and Ifa, are more than just names. They carry stories, spiritual functions, and teachings. Interestingly, many of these functions resemble, in essence, the attributions of biblical figures. Is this a coincidence? It is no coincidence that various African oral traditions recount stories of creation, floods, divine laws, and pacts with celestial beings. These narratives did not arise from nothing. They are part of a global spiritual network that, at some point, connected with what we now call the Old Testament. But over time, as Christianity spread through colonization, these connections were severed, distorted, or simply ignored. The burning question is, why have so many centuries of African faith and wisdom been dismissed as mythology? Who would benefit from erasing the spiritual memory of an entire continent? And furthermore, what can this intentional exclusion tell us about our own identity? Because if there is a missing link between African gods and the characters of the Old Testament, recovering this memory is not just an act of historical investigation. It is a rescue of identity, of belonging, of spiritual power. And at this point, you begin to realize that this is not just a theological curiosity, it's a matter of spiritual justice. How many people, unaware of their ancestral roots, have come to reject themselves? How many cultures have been forced to abandon their original spiritual codes to fit into an imposed faith? What if, instead of choosing between African faith and biblical faith, the truth is that they are part of the same great story? A story that was divided, but that is now beginning to reconnect. Ultimately, there is nothing more dangerous to a system of domination than a people reconnecting with their own spirituality. A people who understand that their ancestors were not idolaters, but guardians of profound knowledge that, in many respects, aligns with the spiritual principles of the Old Testament itself. And that is exactly what we are doing here, reconnecting the dots, tearing down walls, and lighting lights where, for a long time, only darkness existed. So tell me, have you ever stopped to reflect on the erasure of African spirituality in the Bible? Have you ever felt that something important was missing from this narrative? Comment below with the word ancestry if this makes sense to you. Or better yet, write "I honor my ancestors" if you feel this video is helping you reconnect with your spiritual roots. Let's strengthen this conversation in the comments, because the more we share, the more light we shed on this forgotten mystery. And the journey is only beginning. And it is precisely from this reconnection with ancestry that we begin to see, more clearly, one of the most controversial and at the same time fascinating points of this spiritual investigation: the surprising similarity between the Elohim of the Old Testament and the Orishas of African traditions, especially Candomblé and the Yoruba worldview. When we talk about this, we are not trying to force a superficial equivalence between different beliefs, nor suggesting that one copied the other, but rather hypothesizing that both may have originated from the same ancient spiritual root, predating organized religions, in an era when the spiritual world was understood in a much more integrated way than it is today. For many, the Elohim are simply a plural form of God in Hebrew, the famous Elohim, used in the opening lines of Genesis. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. But what few know, and even fewer question, is why the term is plural, and it's not an empty plural. Throughout the Old Testament, we see numerous references to sons of God, angels of the Lord, celestial beings who fulfill specific functions, each with distinct characteristics, personalities, and clear attributions. Doesn't it seem strange to think that the one and absolute God of monotheism is surrounded by such a well-defined spiritual court? Who are these beings? What exactly is their role? And why do they seem to act so similarly to the Orishas of African tradition? In the Yoruba tradition, the Orishas are not gods in the classic polytheistic sense. Like in Greco-Roman mythology, they are forces of nature, spiritual intelligences that represent aspects of the whole, specific expressions of a greater divine energy, just like the Elohim, who act under the command of the Almighty, performing tasks involving justice, protection, communication, healing, war, and spiritual guidance. In both spiritual structures, we see the figure of a supreme God, Olorin for the Yoruba, El Elyon or Yahweh for the Hebrews, surrounded by intermediary beings who interact directly with humans and creation. Let's take a closer look at these similarities. The Orisha Zango, for example, is associated with justice, thunder, and the fire that illuminates and corrects. This doesn't seem far removed from the image of the warrior Elohim, who appears in biblical passages as the Lord of hosts, bringing judgment and balance to the nations. Oxum, linked to fresh water, love, and fertility, strongly resembles the attributes of spiritual beings connected to life, such as the angelic messengers who announce miraculous births or bring specific blessings to barren women. Stories that recur in the Old Testament, like those of Sarah, Hannah, or Elizabeth. Ogun, the Orisha of iron, war, and technology, bears a symbolic resemblance to angels wielding flaming swords, such as the one guarding the path to the tree of life in Genesis, or even to the archangel Michael, who wages spiritual battles in the invisible world. And what about Obatala, considered the shaper of the human body, the craftsman of creation? The Bible says that man was formed from the dust of the earth, molded by the hands of God, hands which, within the logic of a spiritual hierarchy, could very well have been represented by a being with the mission of creating forms, matter, and body. We are not saying that the names and forms are the same, but the functions, archetypes, and spiritual logic are strikingly similar. In both worldviews, we have a universe organized in spiritual layers, with beings that act as bridges between the human and the divine, each with a specialty, a domain, and a personality. The Orishas and the Elohim are entities that do not compete with the Supreme Creator, but act in alignment with Him, fulfilling His will at different levels of existence. And it doesn't stop there. The very idea of spiritual hierarchy is shared in both traditions. In Candomblé, initiates learn that there are levels of consciousness and responsibility, that some Orishas are older or higher in wisdom. Similarly, the Old Testament describes angels, archangels, cherubim, seraphim, a celestial hierarchy where each being has its place, its mission, its frequency. One curious detail: in both spiritual systems, human contact with these entities requires preparation, purity, respect, and ritual. Nothing is done lightly. There are prayers, offerings, codes, and moral conduct. The spiritual world is sacred, not a place for bargaining. This vision of sacredness also brings the two traditions closer together and makes us reflect. Are we really talking about opposing systems, or are we just using different names to describe similar spiritual experiences? What is most striking is that, despite these striking similarities, few dare to make this comparison. Why? Fear? Prejudice? Control? Perhaps because admitting this connection would force many religious institutions to revise centuries of doctrine. Perhaps because recognizing these similarities would return to the African people something that has been stolen from them, the right to be recognized as guardians of a spirituality as legitimate and profound as that recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. And when we understand this, something changes within us. Because we begin to realize that this separation between the African sacred and the biblical sacred may never have truly existed. It was created, imposed, forged by historical interests that decided that one people should be seen as barbaric, while the other would be the chosen people. But what if both are chosen? What if both are heirs to the same divine breath, expressed in different ways around the world? Of course, these questions don't have easy answers, and that's not our goal here. Our goal is to expand awareness, raise questions, shake up structures, to bring to light what has been hidden for centuries, and to invite you to reflect, along with me, on what this means for your own faith, your own spiritual journey, your identity as a human being and as a son or daughter of the Creator. Now tell me, had you ever noticed any similarities between the Orishas and the spiritual beings of the Bible? Have you ever felt that there is something greater connecting these traditions? Comment below with the word connection, or write, "I recognize ancestral wisdom," if this is opening your eyes to something new. And if you want to go further, tell me in the comments. Which Orisha or which spiritual character from the Bible inspires you the most? Let's nurture this conversation with respect, depth, and sincere inquiry, because believe me, there is still much that needs to be revealed. And in the next section, we will go even deeper. And as we connect these spiritual points that have been deliberately disconnected throughout history, we begin to realize that the silence about Africa in the Scriptures is not absence, it is erasure. It is as if the Bible, instead of denying the African presence, is full of echoes of it, but disguised, camouflaged, subtle, scattered in names that few bother to investigate in depth. Names like Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan. These are not merely ancient names that appear in passing in the early chapters of Genesis. They are much more than that. They are clues, keys, traces of an entire continent that participated in the spiritual foundations of humanity, but which was sidelined in the official construction of sacred history. Let's start with Cush. When you read this name in the Bible, you are faced with a direct reference to what we know today as Ethiopia. Cush was one of the sons of Ham, grandson of Noah, and his descendants occupied a vast region that stretched from the Nile to the deepest lands of East Africa. Ethiopia is a land that breathes spirituality to this day, carrying ancient traditions that have survived time, colonization, and even attempts at erasure. It is no coincidence that the Old Testament itself mentions Ethiopia several times as a powerful, respected, and feared people. The question that arises is, why then was this people pushed to the margins of theology? Why, if Ethiopia had so much spiritual weight, was it silently removed from the center of the biblical narrative? Then we have Mizraim, another son of Ham. identified as the ancestor of Egypt. And here lies one of the greatest contradictions in the Western reading of the Bible. Egypt is everywhere in the scriptures. It was there that Joseph became governor, that Moses was raised, that the Hebrew people multiplied, that the miracles of the Exodus took place. And yet, Egypt is always presented with a certain negative bias, as the oppressor, the pagan, the opposite of the people of God. But was this construction made with historical honesty, or was it shaped to create a dichotomy between light and darkness, in which what came from Africa had to be necessarily placed in the shadow? Mizraim is no ordinary name. It represents an entire civilization, one of the most advanced in human history, with astronomical, architectural, medical, and above all, spiritual knowledge. Egypt had its mystery schools, its sacred rituals, its profound understanding of the soul and the afterlife. And this is unsettling, because if we acknowledge that the Egyptians had a developed and ancient spirituality, it calls into question the idea that divine revelation began from scratch with the Hebrew patriarchs. And once again, Africa is silenced, not for lack of presence, but for an excess of power. Put is another name mentioned, less explored but equally significant. Put was also a descendant of Ham, and it is believed that his descendants inhabited the region that today comprises parts of Libya and North Africa. And curiously, this people appears in some prophecies as allies of great empires, such as Babylon and Egypt, being part of the powerful armies of the time. So, again, we see the African presence inserted in the biblical narrative, but in a way that never grants it spiritual protagonism. They are military allies, historical instruments, but never heirs to a revelation. And finally, Canaan. This is perhaps the most controversial name of all. Canaan was also a son of Ham, and his descendants occupied a region stretching from Lebanon to parts of present-day Palestine and Syria. And look how interesting. The land promised to the people of Israel was the land of Canaan. In other words, God promised his people a land that was already inhabited by direct descendants of Ham, that is, African or Afro-Asiatic peoples, depending on the historical timeline. That makes you think, doesn't it? The land where the revelation would happen, where the commandments would be given, where the temple would be built, was originally inhabited by peoples who carried African blood in their lineage. And yet, this information is often ignored or treated with disdain. Over time, the geopolitics of faith has been shaped using Eurocentric maps. The spiritual center was shifted northward, to Jerusalem, then to Rome, then to Europe, and finally to the colonial empires that carried Christianity to the world, but with a new guise: white, Western, and often anti-African. And in this process, Africa was excluded as a spiritual cradle, not because it lacked presence, but because it had too much presence, a presence that was unsettling, a presence that threatened the constructed narrative that light came from the north and darkness from the south. But the traces remain. Ham, the African patriarch, was cursed in the traditional narrative for a misinterpreted episode involving Noah. This curse was, for centuries, used to justify the enslavement of African peoples, a manipulated, distorted, and criminal interpretation of a biblical text. Because if you look closely, you will realize that the curse was on Canaan, not on Ham or his other sons. But the dominant theological discourse needed to create a spiritual argument to justify domination. And so the African continent was condemned for something that even the Bible does not clearly state. Is it revolting? Yes. Is it painful? Very. But it's also liberating, because when you begin to see all this, you realize that the Bible you were taught may not be the complete Bible, and that the absence of Africa in modern theology is a construct, not a fact. Africa is there, in every genealogy, in every ancient name, in every trace hidden between the lines of the sacred text. It is there as a source, as a root, as an origin. And perhaps, precisely for that reason, it has been silenced for so long. So the question that remains is, if these African peoples were there from the beginning, and if they were part of building the spiritual landscape where it all began, why were we taught to see Africa as a continent without light? Why weren't we told that the land from which the sons of Ham came was also a land of wisdom, of connection with the divine, of ancient pacts and profound spiritual power? Tell me in the comments, did you already know that Cush, Mizraim, and Canaan were descendants of the Africans mentioned in the Bible? Or is this information opening a new perspective for you? Comment with the word awakening if this content touched you. Or write, Africa is in the Bible, if you also believe that this history needs to be urgently reclaimed. Let's make this knowledge resonate, because when we share these truths, we break the chains of forgetfulness, and what comes next will surprise you even more. Now that we can see more clearly how the African presence is, in fact, ingrained in the scriptures, even if camouflaged or silenced, we need to delve into 3 specific regions that carry a gigantic spiritual weight, but which are rarely recognized as a legitimate part of the formation of the biblical scenario: Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. These lands, which many today see only as places of desert, conflict, and poverty, in fact, hold a spiritual heritage that directly impacted the pillars of the Judeo-Christian faith, and the Bible, even unintentionally, leaves clear traces of this throughout the Old and New Testaments. Let's begin with Egypt, perhaps the most mentioned African region in the scriptures. Egypt is not just a scene of oppression. It is also a place of protection, growth, revelations, and divine encounters. Joseph, son of Jacob, not only survived there, he became governor of an empire that was considered at that time the pinnacle of civilization. A Hebrew from a shepherd family becomes a leader in a society highly developed in engineering, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and above all, spirituality. What does this show us? That Joseph, by living in Egypt, had direct contact with an ancient wisdom that went far beyond what patriarchal tradition had taught him. He interpreted dreams, yes, but it was in Egypt that this ability was recognized, valued, and put at the service of an empire. And then we have Moses, who was not only born under Egyptian oppression but was raised within the pharaonic court. Moses didn't grow up as a simple Hebrew slave. He was educated as an African prince, with access to all the knowledge of the Egyptian elite. He studied philosophy, war strategies, leadership, magic, law, and everything that a priestly education of the time could offer. The Bible says he was powerful in words and deeds. Do you really think that came only from living with the Hebrews? No. Moses absorbed the most advanced African wisdom, and then it was precisely this man, molded in Egypt, who would be called by God to liberate his people. Liberation doesn't begin with an ordinary man. It begins with someone who deeply understood both worlds, the spiritual and the political, the Hebrew and the African, the desert and the palace. And the most curious thing is that after liberation, when God gives Moses the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, many elements of the legal system and the very structure of the tabernacle strongly resemble Egyptian spiritual codes, purification practices, sacred objects, the use of gold, incense, priesthood, and specific garments. It's as if Moses brought a spiritual synthesis between what God revealed and what had already been practiced for millennia in the mystery schools of Egypt. And why does nobody talk about this? Because it would be acknowledging that Africa, and not Europe or the Middle East, was the true cradle of the deepest forms of practical, ritualistic, and symbolic spirituality that directly influenced Jewish worship. And when we look at the life of Jesus, the connection deepens even further. Because yes, Jesus also had a chapter of his story on African soil. Few people reflect on the spiritual weight of the fact that the Son of God was protected in Egypt when his life was in danger. Why did God choose Egypt? Why didn't he take Jesus' family to Greece, Rome, or Babylon? Because Egypt had always been a refuge, fertile ground for those who carried the light. And there, the child Jesus lived his first years, absorbing the vibration of an ancestral place, full of secrets, symbols, and connection with the invisible. When you think about this, you can't help but wonder, wasn't part of what Jesus taught as an adult also shaped by this spiritual experience in his early years? And now, broadening this perspective, we need to consider Ethiopia, a nation that carries spirituality in its deepest roots. Ethiopia appears at various points in the Bible, but one of the most impactful is the encounter between the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip in the book of Acts. This man came from Jerusalem, where he had gone to worship. This means that Ethiopia not only knew the faith of the God of Israel, but practiced it, was involved in it, and participated in its revelation. Ethiopia has a millennial Judeo-Christian tradition. Its records speak of the presence of the Ark of the Covenant in its lands, of the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon, an African woman who sits before the wisest king in the Bible and tests him with complex spiritual questions. And he, impressed, honors her intelligence. Once again, Africa appears as a source of wisdom, not as a people without light, but as bearers of a powerful spiritual heritage. And then we have Sudan, a strategic region at the crossroads of African and ancient Near Eastern cultures. Sudan, at that time, was part of the so-called Kingdom of Kush, a military and spiritual power. Its people were known for their bravery, their knowledge of the stars, and their devotion to the ancient gods, who, in many traditions, are the same ones we know today as Orishas, Neteris, or even Elohim. And note well, the prophet Isaiah speaks of the people of Kush as a people of tall stature, dark skin, feared by the nations, and whose destiny would still be connected to the throne of God. How can this be ignored? These regions, Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, were not the periphery. They were the center of spiritual knowledge, of contact with the divine, of the construction of symbols that would later be absorbed by Judaism and even Christianity. And when we understand this, everything changes, because it's not just about correcting history, it's about healing a deep spiritual wound, the idea that Africa is inferior, when in fact, it is the foundation. Now tell me honestly, have you ever stopped to think that Jesus set foot on African soil? That Moses was educated in the spiritual schools of Egypt? That Ethiopia preserves to this day a spiritual tradition older than many modern churches? Comment below with the phrase, African spirituality is rooted, if this is truly touching you. Or write, Jesus was in Africa, if this detail impacted you. Let's put these truths into circulation, because the more light we shed on what has been hidden, the closer we get to reconnecting with the truth. And in the next section, we're going to take an even bolder step in this investigation. Get ready, because what comes next will shake everything you've heard about spirituality and revelation. And when we begin to question the role that Africa has had, and still has, within the spiritual narrative of humanity, we inevitably encounter one of the most controversial questions in this entire investigation. Who really were the so-called ancient gods, those beings that emerge in ancient traditions, not only from Africa, but from various parts of the world, and that appear as powerful figures, bearers of advanced knowledge, inexplicable technologies, mastery over the elements, and above all, with a direct connection to the invisible world? Were these figures really gods in the sense that we understand them today? Or were they real spiritual beings, acting among humans, but interpreted in different ways by different cultures? This question, in itself, already has the power to shake centuries of fixed theological interpretations, especially when we consider that the Bible does not deny the existence of these beings, quite the contrary. And here comes a point that many people avoid touching on: the Book of Enoch, an ancient text, excluded from the traditional biblical canon, but which sheds light on profound mysteries. In it, we find the narrative of the Watchers, angels sent to earth who become corrupted by interacting with humans and end up teaching men knowledge that was, until then, restricted to heaven. According to Enoch, these Watchers taught the secrets of herbs, weapons, metals, astrology, spiritual runes, incantations, and even the practices of magic and energy manipulation. They were responsible for opening spiritual doors that God Himself had closed for the protection of humanity. And what was the consequence of this? They were cast into eternal imprisonment, and the children born between these spiritual beings and human women, the so-called Nephilim, became giants, corruptors of the earth, and according to the text, were one of the causes of the flood. Now stop and think with me. What if the gods of ancient cultures, including those of African peoples, are precisely these beings? What if what was considered divinity in some traditions was actually a type of powerful but fallen spiritual being? An angel, an intermediary, an Elohim, an ancestral spirit that crossed the boundaries between worlds and left traces in the collective memory of humanity? Could it be that what the Yoruba call Orishas, the Egyptians called Neteris, the Sumerians called Anunnaki, and the Hebrews called Elohim, are distinct cultural manifestations of the same spiritual reality? Of course, this doesn't mean that all beings worshipped in African or Eastern traditions are evil, but it opens a dangerous yet necessary path for reflection. Were some of these entities acting legitimately, fulfilling a real spiritual role? Or were some of them, in fact, fallen angels who presented themselves as deities and assumed worship that did not belong to them? The problem is that when spirituality is interpreted outside its original context, the line between revelation and spiritual corruption becomes blurred. The Book of Enoch clearly shows that the Watchers were not merely rebels, but spiritual seducers. They did not impose their dominion by force. They charmed, they manipulated, they taught sacred wisdom for selfish purposes. And here enters a very delicate issue. Knowledge, when delivered out of time and spiritual maturity, becomes destruction. The Bible has always been very clear about this. There is knowledge that is only revealed to those who are prepared. The prophets of the Old Testament were often prevented from writing certain visions. John in Revelation was instructed not to record parts of what he saw, because not everything is for everyone. And perhaps the great conflict between God's angels and the so-called ancient gods is this. The former serve the divine plan and submit to the will of the Almighty. The latter sought glory for themselves, built empires and temples, demanded offerings, and often established spiritual systems that, even rich in symbols and rituals, distanced humanity from the original source. And what if these entities, present in so many traditions, are the same beings that the Bible warns against as principalities and powers of the heavenly realms? Spiritual warfare is not only moral, it is also about memory, narrative, and influence. And here comes a profound thought. Could part of humanity's spiritual confusion stem from the fact that we have confused servants with masters? From having elevated intermediaries to the status of divine source? From having exchanged direct contact with God for complex systems that often feed the spiritual ego more than the spirit itself? When we look at ancient African traditions, we see that not all of them treat the Orishas, for example, as absolute gods. Many treat them as elevated spirits, as energies, as consciousnesses, as tools of God. And that changes everything. Because the problem is not in the recognition of these beings, but in the way they were used, invoked, and placed at the center of worship. What is dangerous is losing focus on the source. It is inverting the order. And when that happens, we open space for a spiritual corruption that disguises itself as light, but operates in the shadows. And that's exactly the kind of discernment that many spiritual leaders avoid having. Because it's easier to demonize all African spirituality than to recognize and study it in depth. It's simpler to say, this is the work of the devil, than to understand the spiritual layers behind rituals, symbols, and ancestral names that carry codes that even the prophets themselves had difficulty deciphering. But here, in this video, the proposal is different. It's about looking with courage. It's about investigating with respect. It's about removing the veil of ignorance without fear of what we will find. And at this point, you need to reflect with me. If the Watchers came to Earth and taught knowledge that was recorded, repeated, and systematized in religious practices, where are these teachings today? In what rituals have they survived? In what doctrines have they been recycled? Under what names are they still invoked? Because what was planted back then still bears fruit, and not all of it is good. That's why spiritual discernment isn't about religiosity. It's about perception, about frequency, about knowing how to separate true light from illusory light. Now, I want to know from you, had you ever heard of the Book of Enoch? Have you ever stopped to think that the ancient gods may have been fallen angels? That much of what was passed down as wisdom may have come from a corrupted spiritual source. Comment below with the phrase, "Not all brilliance comes from the light," if this passage resonated with you. Or write, "I am seeking discernment," if you feel you are in this process of awakening. Your opinion is very important, and your search is sacred, and our journey doesn't end here. What comes next may reveal even more of what lies behind the spiritual history of humanity. So stay with me, because the truth persists. And now that we have delved into the deepest layers of ancient spirituality and the possible identities of the so-called gods, who may have been, in many cases, fallen angels, celestial beings, or even legitimate manifestations of spiritual forces, we need to talk about one of the thorniest and at the same time most urgent issues within this investigation. How and why were African deities transformed over the centuries into demons, into evil figures, into declared enemies of the true God? Because it is no longer possible to ignore that there was indeed a strategy, not only spiritual but also political and social, that associated everything that came from Africa with darkness, sin, error, and perdition. But was this truly a legitimate spiritual revelation? Or was it ideological manipulation disguised as faith? When European colonizers arrived in Africa, they did not find a wild continent devoid of God, as many textbooks insisted on teaching. They found organized civilizations with complex spiritual systems, well-defined cosmologies, priests, rituals, temples, doctrines, respect for the elements of nature, and a profound reverence for ancestors. It was a living, practical, everyday spirituality that was part of the social fabric of each people. And it was precisely this solid spiritual structure that came to be seen as a threat. Because think about it. How do you dominate a people who are aware of their spiritual identity? How do you convince someone that they are inferior if they know that they carry within themselves the strength of their ancestors, their Orishas, their deities, their direct connection with the Creator? It's impossible. So it was necessary to destroy this foundation. And the most effective way to do this was by demonizing everything that was native, everything that was African, everything that didn't fit within the colonizing European theology. The question that remains, and that you need to carry with you until the end of this video is, was this spiritual or political? Was it a divine revelation or a strategic imposition? Because you see, when Europeans imposed Christianity on African peoples, there was no spiritual dialogue. There was violence. There was censorship. There was imposition. They arrived saying that the African gods were demons, that the Orishas were evil spirits, that the rituals were witchcraft, and that the only way to salvation was through a religion that came with weapons, armies, exploitation, and slavery. How can this be reconciled with the pure gospel of Christ, which spoke of love, liberation, justice, and truth? What they did to the African gods was more than theological. It was genocidal. Because by demonizing the symbols, the deities, the names, the rhythms, the chants, the foods, the bodies, and the spiritual expressions of Africans, the colonizer not only erased a religion, he tried to erase the soul of a people. He transformed prayers into witchcraft. He transformed dances into demonic possession. He transformed priests into sorcerers. He transformed ancestral wisdom into spiritual ignorance. And the saddest thing is that many of the descendants of these people still carry this unconscious guilt, this internalized fear, this feeling that their roots are impure, when in fact it was the colonial lens that distorted everything. Have you ever noticed how, even today, if someone mentions Orishas, Ifa, or ancestry, there's an immediate negative reaction as if it were something from the darkness? This isn't by chance. It was programmed. It was taught for centuries. Religious colonization didn't end with the end of slavery. It perpetuated itself in churches, schools, theology books, films, soap operas, and speeches. Even today, many Pentecostal churches associate any African spiritual manifestation with the action of demons, without even studying in depth what each symbol represents, its context, its origin, or the spiritual function of that element. It's ignorance, yes, but it's also fear. Fear of facing a truth that would dismantle centuries of spiritual domination. And here's a thought-provoking question. If the Spirit of God dwells where there is truth, justice, and love, why couldn't he also dwell in the sacred spaces, in the villages, in the African houses of worship, in the hearts that dance for oxum or invoke Zango asking for justice? Would the Creator really limit himself to a European doctrine built on the blood of entire peoples? Is salvation conditional upon colonization? Or has African spirituality, even when silenced, always been a legitimate expression of the divine presence? The demonization of African deities was a precise blow. It not only destroyed symbols, but it severed the bridge between millions of people and their ancestors, their identity, and their inner strength. When a people loses its sense of who it is spiritually, it becomes vulnerable, manipulable, and enslavable. And that is what happened. The Orishas were not demons. They were spiritual forces interpreted with reverence, love, and responsibility. The problem was not the presence of the Orishas. The problem was that they did not obey the new God imposed by the crown and the cross. And if we delve even deeper, we realize that this demonization served to justify slavery. Because if Africans were possessed by demons, then it was justifiable to save them through captivity, forced baptism, and violent catechism. Do you see how everything was constructed as a mechanism of control? and how spiritual discourse was used as a weapon. And even after so many centuries, this narrative still survives. There are still those who say that drums summon demons, that Orishas dances are possessions, that children of the saints are lost. But what these people never stop to ask is, what are they feeling when they hear these rhythms? What are they fearing? Is it really evil? Or is it the force of something they cannot understand? Is the problem spiritual? Or is it just prejudice? That is why reclaiming these narratives is an act of healing, of spiritual healing, of identity, and of justice. Because we can no longer accept that the Bible is used as an instrument of condemnation against the children of Africa. We can no longer hear that everything that comes from African culture is sin. We can no longer continue to feed a theological structure that has roots in colonization and not in the love of God. And here I want to give you space to reflect with me. Have you ever wondered where this fear of African spirituality comes from? Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps what you've been told is evil might actually be sacred? Comment below with the word liberation if this is opening your eyes. Or write, I recognize the wisdom of my ancestors if you feel this video is reconnecting you with your spiritual truth. Let's break this cycle together, because we still have much to reveal, and in the next part, we'll go even deeper into this journey that is only just beginning. And when we begin to make room for a fairer, deeper, and more decolonized reading of the scriptures, a new question emerges, even more provocative, and even more silenced by traditional narratives. What if the people of Israel not only passed through Africa, but left part of their blood, their culture, their spirituality there? What if part of the Hebrew people were not only formed in Egypt, but remained on African soil, mixed, married, adapted, creating a spiritual lineage forgotten by Western theology? When we talk about the forgotten legacy of Israel in Africa, we are not referring to empty speculation. We are talking about evidence, preserved oral traditions, and Jewish customs found in African tribes that never had direct contact with Europe, but who have always affirmed, generation after generation, that they were descendants of the tribes of Israel. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from the Igbo people, who live mainly in the region of Nigeria. To this day, they maintain practices and symbols that resemble ancient Jewish customs. They observe the Sabbath. They circumcise their sons on the 8th day. They follow dietary laws similar to kashrut. They have songs, festivals, and rituals that echo with striking similarity the records of the Old Testament. And most strikingly, many Igbo elders claim to be direct descendants of the tribe of Gad, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is not internet theory. This is living oral history, passed down from father to son for centuries, even before any Jewish or evangelical missions arrived in that region. And it doesn't stop there. In Ethiopia, we find the so-called Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, a people who have preserved Jewish practices for millennia without any influence from European rabbinic Judaism. They maintained their own version of the Torah, their festivals, their purity rituals, the concept of priesthood, the observance of the Sabbath, and even a deep respect for the Ark of the Covenant, which, according to their traditions, was taken to Aksum, where it remains hidden to this day. And here's a curious detail. These Ethiopian Jews were only recognized as legitimate Jews by modern Israel in 1975, when the government, pressured by historical and political evidence, authorized the rescue and immigration operation of the Beta Israel to the Holy Land. But the question remains, why did it take so long? Why were these peoples ignored, discredited, treated as impostors or even pagans for centuries? Was the real reason spiritual, or simply political and racial? Because recognizing that the lost tribes of Israel may be among the African peoples would also mean recognizing that the face of the biblical Hebrew may not be the European face depicted in Sunday school illustrations, and that, for many, is still unacceptable. Sudan, for example, also holds echoes of this presence. Many of the nomadic peoples of northern Sudan and the Horn of Africa claim Israelite descent. Their traditions, even diluted by time, still carry ancestral Hebrew elements. And this makes us reflect. When the northern tribes were dispersed, as recorded in the scriptures, did they hide only in Asia, or did they find refuge in the land where they already had ties, where they already had ancestry, where they had already left their footprints in the time of Egypt and Canaan? The Bible speaks of the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and many theologians interpret this merely as a spiritual metaphor. But what if it's literal? What if these lost sheep are alive, with their identity, culture, and faith preserved, just waiting to be recognized? What if part of this people is in the heart of Africa, keeping alive a flame that was rejected by the world, but not forgotten by God? Many religious leaders on the African continent, especially among the peoples of West Africa, claim that their roots are in Israel. And this doesn't stem from a modern desire for connection with Judaism, but from ancient traditions that point to a common origin. They speak of millennia-old migrations, persecutions, escapes, prophecies, and forgotten alliances. And when you cross-reference these accounts with the gaps left by the Bible regarding the fate of the exiled tribes, everything begins to fall into place. And here's another powerful point. What if this connection between Israel and Africa wasn't just a geographical and historical reality, but a spiritual one? What if the chosen people have always been scattered, not to be confused, but to be a light among the nations, on every continent? What if the idea that only those who live within a specific geographical territory are heirs to the promise is wrong? What if the promise has always been greater, more encompassing, more alive? If we look closely, we will see that Jesus himself said that he came to seek the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And what if these sheep are in territories where traditional theology has never bothered to search? What if, precisely because they are outside the official religious radar, they have been kept protected until the time of awakening, of return, of reconnection? What you may not know is that there are several silent but very serious initiatives investigating the DNA, customs, and origins of African peoples with clear signs of Israelite descent. And with each discovery, with each research project, a hidden truth comes to light. The legacy of Israel is not European. It is plural. It is mixed. It is black. It is indigenous. It is alive. And it pulsates in the drums, the dances, the prayers, and the genealogies of peoples who never abandoned their faith, even when it was despised by the world. Now tell me honestly, had you ever heard of African Jews? Did you know that the Igbo identify as descendants of the tribes of Israel? Have you heard of the Beta Israel people of Ethiopia? Comment below with the phrase, "I am an heir to the promise," if it resonates with something within you. Or write, "The sheep are awakening," if you feel that this truth needs to be revealed to the world. Because what was lost, God is restoring. And the next part of this journey will reveal something even deeper. Don't go away, because the truth is closer than ever. And as we unearth these forgotten threads that connect Africa, Israel, and ancestral spirituality, there's no way to ignore something that pulsates almost invisibly, but profoundly revealingly: language. Because if there is something that survives the centuries, even when structures fall, even when temples are destroyed, even when history is rewritten, it is the spiritual language of a people. It not only communicates, it carries codes, memories, frequencies. And when we begin to compare the sounds, symbols, names, and phonetic roots of archaic Hebrew with traditional African languages like Yoruba, Ewe, and Bantu, the feeling is that we are facing a truth that has been camouflaged for centuries, but which is now about to emerge. Let's start with the most obvious. Hebrew did not arise in isolation. It formed in a geographical context where diverse ethnicities, languages, and cultures coexisted, and often mixed. The Hebrew language, in its oldest form, shared guttural sounds, syllabic structures, and even symbolism with other Semitic and African languages. And when we compare it with languages like Yoruba, for example, it is impossible not to notice the sonic and spiritual similarities in sacred names, invocations, and especially in tonal emphasis. In Yoruba, each intonation completely changes the meaning of a word. The language is alive, musical, full of energy, and the same is true of biblical Hebrew. Both treat the word as a spiritual channel. It's not just what is said, it's how it is said. And this is no coincidence. These languages were not built solely for horizontal communication between people. They were shaped as vertical channels to dialogue with the invisible, with the sacred, with the divine. And then things start to get even more interesting when we look at specific names. For example, in Hebrew, the word ruach means spirit, wind, breath of God. Now observe the phonetic and symbolic similarity with the term Orun in Yoruba, which means heaven or spiritual world. Both carry the notion of invisible movement, of a spiritual dimension, of that which blows, which envelops, which manifests itself without physical form. But it doesn't stop there. In Hebrew, we have the term Elohim, a plural of majesty for God. Now consider Yoruba. We have Olodumare, the supreme God, but we also have the Orishas, spiritual entities that carry aspects of the divine. There is a similar spiritual architecture here, a supreme creator God, inaccessible directly, and intermediary entities that manifest his will. In both contexts, the spiritual hierarchy is composed of beings that carry specific aspects of the creator, and the language that names them reveals this complexity with almost surgical precision. And let's talk about sounds. In ancient Hebrew, many sacred words were chanted with cantilinas, a kind of spiritual melody. This practice is not only liturgical, it is energetic. Sound transforms the environment, alters the frequency. The same happens in African rituals, where chants in Yoruba, Bantu, and other languages serve not only for communication, but for spiritual activation. Sound calls. Sound opens portals. Sound invokes presences. And in both Hebrew and African practices, the names of God and spiritual beings are not just titles, they are spiritual keys. Another revealing example. In Hebrew, Shaddai is one of the names of God, representing the Almighty God, the Sustainer. In the Bantu tradition, especially in the Congo region, there is the word Nzambi, or Nzambi Ampungu, to refer to the Supreme God, also a sustainer, creator, the one who nourishes life. In both languages, the idea of a being that provides support, that sustains the cosmos, is present even in the way the name is structured. They are not just names, they are linguistic structures laden with profound spiritual meaning. And if we go back even further in time to Proto-Hebrew or Paleo-Hebrew, before the square form used today, we find letters that were ideograms, images that represented concepts. For example, the letter Aleph was represented by a bull's head, symbolizing strength and leadership. And guess what? In several African cultures, especially among the peoples of the central and western parts of the continent, the ox, the bull, or the buffalo are sacred symbols, used to represent leadership, ancestry, and spiritual strength. Coincidence? Or shared heritage? If the names reveal this connection, the rituals confirm it. Many African prayers, recited in native languages, carry sounds that, when pronounced, resemble Hebrew expressions. Expressions like ash, from Yoruba, meaning so be it, have a force similar to the Hebrew Amen. Both carry a spiritual seal, a confirmation, an activation. Both encapsulate an idea with authority, and they are used not only at the end of sentences, but as seals of power. And that's when we realize that African and Hebrew spiritual languages are not disconnected. They are sister languages. They grew in neighboring lands, nourished by cultures that touched, influenced, and intertwined. The separation only happened later, when empires and religions sought to impose their languages and erase the previous ones. But the sounds endure, the names endure, because the language of the Spirit is like water, it finds cracks, and where there is truth, it springs forth. And this linguistic connection doesn't just serve to fuel our curiosity, it points us to something greater. The spirituality that unites us is older than the systems that divide us. Language is not just a code, it's a frequency. When you speak the name of an ancestor, an Orisha, a biblical patriarch, you're not just pronouncing a word. You're accessing a spiritual lineage. You're interacting with frequencies that span millennia, and this responsibility demands awareness. Therefore, when they tried to erase African languages, when they prohibited the use of Yoruba, Ewe, and Bantu in religious practices and spiritual circles, it wasn't just a matter of cultural oppression. It was a spiritual war, because silencing the language is trying to silence the spirit. But how can you silence what was created to call upon the invisible? How can you silence a frequency that vibrates within the blood? And today, as many of us return to studying Hebrew, to reconnecting with ancestral spiritual roots, to listening to the words of our elders in languages that were once despised, we are reclaiming something more than vocabulary. We are recovering an ancient spiritual bond that still pulsates, still speaks, still calls. And this call is echoing now, through this video, through your listening, through the awakening that has already begun. Now tell me, had you already noticed these similarities between Hebrew and African languages? Have you heard sounds or names that made you feel there was something familiar there, even without understanding it mentally? Comment here with the phrase, "Words have power," if this makes sense to you. Or write, "I hear the voice of the ancestors," if you feel you are rediscovering the spiritual language of your origin. Share this video with anyone who needs to remember the language of the soul, because the next part will take us even deeper on the journey of reconnection, and it can't be done alone. We'll continue exactly where we left off. If, up to this point, you felt your mind being stirred, your spirit touched, and your heart opening to possibilities that once seemed distant, then now it's time to take an even deeper step. A step that is not merely historical, theological, or cultural, but existential. Because the question we are about to raise is not just about the past. It's about who you are, who you were taught to be, and who you would have been if entire fragments of your spiritual memory hadn't been erased. Think about it honestly. What has been stolen from us? And when I say us, I'm not just talking about one people, one ethnicity, or one culture. I'm talking about everyone who has been, in some way, disconnected from their roots, their sacred origins, their legitimate spiritual heritage. How many stories have been told backward? How many times have you heard that you had nothing to be proud of in your ancestry? How many times have they said that what came before Christ was just darkness, as if the whole world had lived in error until the arrival of European colonization? But what if that's not the case? What if part of your true spiritual identity was deliberately erased? Not to protect you, but to limit you, to domesticate you, so that you would never know how deeply connected you are to the divine. Because look, when you control the spirituality of a people, you control the people themselves. When you dictate which names can be invoked, which words are permitted to be used in prayer, when you say which symbols are holy and which are of the devil, you create an invisible chain, a spiritual prison, where the person may feel connected to God, but in reality is serving a structure that separates them from Him. How many people do you know who are afraid to play a drum, to wear white on holy days, to speak the names of their ancestors? How many have heard that what is part of their spiritual heritage is wrong, impure, dangerous? Now tell me, did this come from God or was it taught by men? Because when God reveals Himself in Scripture, He reveals Himself in diverse ways, as fire, as wind, as voice, as dream, as vision, as light. And at no point does He say that He can only be accessed by a single culture, a single language, a single form of clothing. On the contrary, the Bible is full of moments in which God manifests Himself to people outside the official religious circle, to pagan kings, to foreign women, to Roman soldiers, to repentant sorcerers. What He seeks is a connected heart, not a registered religion. So why so much fear of ancestry? Why so much effort to erase the traces of the ancient gods, the sacred names of Africa, the connections with the Hebrew peoples, the symbols that persist in the sacred grounds, in the villages, in the fields, in the mountains? Because if you reclaim this, if you feel again in your body and soul the sound of your spiritual language, if you reconnect with the strength of your ancestors, with the warmth of the earth, with the vibration of the names that carry memory, no one will control you anymore. And that, for many power systems, is unacceptable. Because a people who know their spiritual origins, who understand their value, who honor their ancestors, and who know they carry the divine spark, do not bow down easily. And that is the true liberation that many fear. The liberation that begins when you stop being afraid of who you are. So tell me, what was stolen from you? Was it the right to look in the mirror and see yourself as the image of God? Was it the right to pray in your native language? Was it the right to dance for God barefoot on the earth that sustains you? Was it the right to see the face of the divine reflected in your skin, in your hair, in your music, in your dreams? For centuries, the dominant spirituality taught that all of this was worldly, impure, profane. But is that really true? Or was the biggest lie told that you needed to reject your ancestry to be accepted by God? Because when we distance ourselves from our roots, we become like a tree uprooted from the ground. It may remain standing for a while, but it doesn't bear fruit. It doesn't grow. And little by little, it withers from within. The problem is that we've learned to call this spiritual life. But now, at this very moment, the ground is being turned over. The roots are being exposed. And with them come the questions the system never wanted you to ask, such as, Why does my story begin in pain and not in glory? Why do I only appear in the Bible as a slave and not as a priest, prophet, warrior, king? Why was my form of worship called witchcraft, but that of my colonizers was called pure worship? Who defined these categories? Who wrote these rules? And who do they serve? It's not just about religion, it's about identity. It's about what you were taught to fear and what you were prevented from loving in yourself. It's about the spiritual guilt planted in the hearts of generations, as if your entire past were a stain. But perhaps, just perhaps, what they told you was shadow was actually your original light. And now that these questions have begun to echo within you, they will no longer leave you in peace, because the awakened spirit does not go back to sleep. And no matter how long you have lived away from your essence, your grounding, your truth, reconnection is always possible. It only takes one step, one choice, one memory, and perhaps that is why you have come this far, because deep down, you always knew. Now, I want to invite you to a moment of truth. If this passage resonated with you, comment here with the phrase, "My memory is awakening," or write, "I honor my ancestors," if you feel this reconnection is happening within you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been taught to be ashamed of their own spiritual heritage, because in the next chapter we will explore something even more revealing, and I need you with me on this journey. The truth is only beginning to emerge. If you've made it this far, that already says a lot about you. You are one of those rare souls who don't shy away from difficult questions, who face the truth head-on, who feel the deep call of reconnection. And for that, my deepest gratitude, from the bottom of my heart. Now, let's seal this journey together. Subscribe to the channel right now, because here we'll continue breaking codes, unearthing truths, and rescuing what was lost. Leave a like if this video sparked something in you. It shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people who are on the same quest. And comment below with the phrase, "The truth set me free." Only those who made it to the end will understand. This helps me know who has truly walked this path with me, and strengthens our connection. And it doesn't stop there. The next video is already on the screen. Click now and continue with me on this profound journey of spiritual reconnection. What comes next may further change how you see your story and your purpose. Let's go all the way together.